Remember the steam rising from your grandmother's kitchen on Christmas Eve? It smelled like patience, broth, carrots, and the soup took hours to make. In 1950s, 30 soups warmed America's winter nights. She started them at sunrise, wooden spoon in hand.
Every time the spoon taps the pot like that, it reminds me of the stories we shared right here at this table.
Stirring love into every bubbling pot. Those soups weren't recipes. They were comfort you could see, warmth poured into bowls that pulled the family close. Now the pots sit cold, the spoons rest silent, and that smell of home is gone. Let's start with number 1. Walk into any Christmas Eve kitchen in 1950 and you'd smell butter, cream, and the ocean all at once. Fresh oysters floated in hot milk, their edges just starting to curl from the heat. A pint of oysters cost 60 cents, milk cost 15 cents, butter cost 20 cents, and crackers cost 10 cents. $1.05 fed 6 people. The oysters made it feel fancy even though it took 15 minutes to make. But here's what made this essential. Christmas Eve meant no heavy food before midnight mass. Oyster stew filled you up without weighing you down. The warm milk settled your stomach. The oysters gave you something substantial to eat. Grandmothers would heat the milk until tiny bubbles formed around the edges, then add butter and oysters. The oysters cooked for exactly 3 minutes. Any longer, and they'd turn tough and rubbery. This wasn't just soup. It was tradition that connected coastal families to the ocean, even on the coldest December night. Every farmhouse kitchen had potatoes in the cellar and leeks in the cold frame. Together, they made soup that tasted like comfort itself. The creamy white soup held chunks of tender potato and soft green leeks. 5 pounds of potatoes cost 20 cents, leeks cost 10 cents, butter cost 15 cents, and cream cost 20 cents. 65 cents fed 8 people. The potatoes made it thick and filling without adding flour. Grandmothers would slice the leeks thin and wash them 3 times to remove all the dirt. The white and pale green parts went into butter until they turned soft and sweet. Potatoes and chicken broth would simmer until the potatoes fell apart. Some got mashed into the soup to make it creamy. The secret was cooking the leeks slowly. Rush them, and they'd taste sharp instead of sweet. This wasn't just potato soup. It was proof that the simplest ingredients could create something elegant when you treated them with patience. Christmas meant using the old hens that stopped laying eggs. The tough birds needed long, slow cooking to become tender. By evening, the broth was golden and rich, filled with homemade egg noodles. 1 old hen cost 50 cents. Flour for noodles cost 10 cents, carrots cost 5 cents, and celery cost 5 cents. 70 cents fed 10 people. The long cooking pulled every bit of flavor from the bones. Grandmothers would simmer the chicken all morning, then pull the meat off the bones by hand. The noodles got rolled thin and cut into strips. They'd drop into the boiling broth and cook until they were tender, but still had some chew. The noodles had to be thin. Thick noodles turned gummy and soaked up too much broth. This wasn't just chicken soup. It was proof that nothing got wasted, and old hens that couldn't lay anymore still had value and purpose. The day after Christmas, the ham bone went into a pot with split peas. By dinner time, the soup was thick enough to stand a spoon in. Green peas had broken down into creamy soup with chunks of ham throughout. Split peas cost 15 cents per pound. A leftover ham bone cost nothing. Carrots cost 5 cents, and onions cost 5 cents. 25 cents fed 12 people. The ham bone flavored the whole pot without adding any extra meat. Grandmothers would simmer the bone for hours, then fish it out and pick off any meat clinging to it. The peas would cook until they dissolved into the broth. Some stayed whole to give texture. The stirring was important. Peas stuck to the bottom and burned if you didn't stir every 15 minutes. This wasn't just leftover soup. It was proof that the ham bone was just as valuable as the ham itself, and nothing from Christmas dinner got thrown away. Beef soup bones cost almost nothing, but they made soup that tasted rich and meaty. Pearl barley swelled up and made the soup thick and satisfying. Carrots, celery, and onions added color and sweetness. Soup bones cost 25 cents. Barley cost 10 cents, and vegetables cost 15 cents. 50 cents fed 10 people. The bones had bits of meat attached, and the marrow inside melted into the broth and made it rich. Grandmothers would roast the bones in the oven first to brown them and develop flavor. The bones would simmer for hours until the meat fell off. The barley went in during the last hour so it wouldn't get mushy. The skimming was important. Fat would rise to the top and had to be spooned off, or the soup would be greasy. This wasn't just soup bones. It was proof that the cheapest cuts of meat could make the most satisfying meals if you knew how to cook them right. Re-hook 5 soups down. You're seeing something. Long cooking times, simple ingredients, and nothing wasted. These weren't quick meals. Grandmothers started them in the morning and tended them all day. They understood that good soup couldn't be rushed, and patience made cheap ingredients taste expensive. Canned tomatoes and leftover rice came together in soup that tasted like summer in December. The red tomato broth held soft grains of white rice. A spoonful of sugar balanced the tomatoes' sourness. Canned tomatoes cost 15 cents, rice cost 10 cents, butter cost 10 cents, and an onion cost 3 cents. 38 cents fed 8 people. The rice soaked up the tomato flavor and turned pink. Grandmothers would cook the onion in butter until it was soft and sweet, then add the tomatoes and crush them with a spoon. The rice went in last so it wouldn't get too soft. A pinch of baking soda cut the tomatoes acid. The sugar was essential. Without it, the soup tasted flat and sour instead of bright and balanced. This wasn't just tomato soup. It was proof that canned goods from summer could bring warmth and color to winter tables. Before it came in cans, cream of mushroom soup was made from scratch with fresh mushrooms, butter, and cream. The soup was pale brown and silky, with pieces of mushroom in every spoonful. Fresh mushrooms cost 35 cents per pound, butter cost 20 cents, flour cost 5 cents, and cream cost 20 cents. 80 cents fed 6 people. The mushrooms made it taste earthy and rich. Grandmothers would slice the mushrooms thin and cook them in butter until they released their water and turned golden. Flour would go in to make a paste, then milk and cream would be stirred in gradually. The soup would simmer until it was thick and smooth. The cooking of the mushrooms was critical. Raw mushrooms added to cream made the soup taste watery and bland. This wasn't just canned soup. It was proof that making things from scratch meant you could taste every ingredient clearly. White navy beans, cooked until they were soft and creamy, made soup that stuck to your ribs. A piece of salt pork flavored the whole pot. The soup was thick, white, and satisfying. Navy beans cost 10 cents per pound. Salt pork cost 20 cents, an onion cost 3 cents, and carrots cost 5 cents. 38 cents fed 12 people. The beans swelled to triple their size during cooking. Grandmothers would soak the beans overnight to soften them. The next day, they'd simmer with salt pork, onions, and carrots for hours. Some beans would dissolve into the broth and make it creamy. Others would stay whole. The soaking was essential. Unsoaked beans took twice as long to cook and gave people gas. This wasn't just bean soup. It was proof that dried beans were insurance against hunger, and a pound of beans could feed a family for days. Cabbage cost almost nothing and made soup that filled the biggest pot. The pale green soup held ribbons of soft cabbage, chunks of potato, and bits of sausage if you were lucky. One cabbage cost 8 cents. Potatoes cost 10 cents, an onion cost 3 cents, and sausage cost 30 cents. 51 cents fed 15 people. The cabbage sweetened as it cooked and lost its sharp smell. Grandmothers would cut the cabbage into thin strips and cook it in butter until it started to soften. Potatoes, onions, and broth would go in next. The soup would simmer until everything was tender. A spoonful of vinegar at the end brightened the flavor. The cutting was important. Thick chunks of cabbage stayed tough and chewy. Thin ribbons became silky and tender. This wasn't just cabbage. It was proof that the cheapest vegetable in winter could feed the most people and still taste good. Canned corn and potatoes made chowder that tasted sweet and creamy. Bacon added smoky flavor and made the whole house smell good. The thick, pale yellow soup had corn kernels in every spoonful. Canned corn cost 15 cents, potatoes cost 10 cents, bacon cost 30 cents, and milk cost 15 cents. 70 cents fed 8 people. The corn's sweetness balanced the salty bacon perfectly. Grandmothers would cook the bacon until it was crispy, then use the bacon fat to cook the onions and potatoes. The corn and milk would go in last. The potatoes would break down slightly and make the soup thick without adding flour. The bacon had to be crispy. Soft bacon made the soup taste greasy instead of smoky. This wasn't just corn soup. It was proof that canned vegetables could taste fresh and sweet if you cooked them right and added the right flavors. Rehook, 10 soups down. Everyone took hours of simmering and filled the house with warmth. Grandmothers knew that soup was more than food. It was comfort you could ladle into bowls. They turned bones, beans, and vegetables into something that made winter bearable and Christmas feel like home. Christmas Eve in French-American families meant French onion soup appeared at the table. The dark brown broth was sweet from hours of cooking onions. Toasted bread floated on top, covered with melted cheese that stretched when you lifted your spoon. 5 pounds of onions cost 20 cents, beef broth cost 15 cents, bread cost 10 cents, and cheese cost 25 cents. 70 cents fed 6 people. The onions cooked for over an hour, until they turned dark brown and sweet as candy. Grandmothers would slice the onions thin and cook them in butter over low heat. The onions would slowly turn from white to golden to deep brown. This took patience and constant stirring. Once the onions were caramelized, beef broth would go in and simmer for another hour. The bread had to be toasted until it was completely dry and hard. Soft bread would dissolve into the soup instead of floating on top. The cheese would melt under the broiler until it was bubbly and brown. The long cooking of the onions was the secret. Rush them, and the soup would taste sharp and bitter instead of sweet and rich. Grandmothers knew that the best flavors came from taking time and not rushing the process. This wasn't just onion soup. It was proof that the humblest vegetable could become something elegant through patience and proper technique. Italian grandmothers made minestrone on Christmas Eve because meatless soup meant they could eat before midnight mass. The thick vegetable soup had beans, pasta, tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were left in the cellar. Every spoonful was different. Canned tomatoes cost 15 cents, beans cost 10 cents, pasta cost 10 cents, and mixed vegetables cost 20 cents. 55 cents fed 10 people. The soup got better every time you reheated it as the flavors blended together. Grandmothers would start with onions, carrots, and celery cooked in olive oil. Canned tomatoes and beans would go in next with plenty of water. The soup would simmer for an hour. Then pasta would be added during the last 15 minutes. A handful of fresh parsley at the end added bright green color. The pasta had to be added at the right time. Too early, and it would get mushy and fall apart. Too late, and it would still be hard when you served the soup. Some grandmothers would stir in a spoonful of pesto at the end. Others would top each bowl with grated Parmesan cheese. The soup was flexible and changed based on what vegetables you had available. This wasn't just vegetable soup. It was proof that meatless meals could be satisfying and filling, and you didn't need meat to make something taste rich and good. Brown lentils cooked down into thick soup that tasted earthy and rich. Carrots and celery added sweetness. A ham bone or piece of salt pork gave it a smoky flavor. The soup was so thick you could almost eat it with a fork. Lentils cost 12 cents per pound. Carrots cost 5 cents. Celery cost 5 cents. And a ham bone cost nothing if you saved it from dinner. 22 cents fed 10 people. Lentils didn't need soaking like beans, so you could make this soup in just a few hours. Grandmothers would cook the vegetables in butter until they were soft, then add the lentils and broth. The soup would simmer until the lentils broke down and made it thick. A splash of vinegar at the end brightened all the flavors. The stirring was important. Lentils stuck to the bottom of the pot and burned if you didn't stir them regularly. The burned taste would ruin the whole pot. Some grandmothers would puree half the soup and leave the other half chunky. This made it extra thick and creamy without adding any cream. This wasn't just lentil soup. It was proof that lentils were cheaper than beans, cooked faster, and made soup that was just as satisfying and filling. New England Christmas meant clam chowder appeared on the table, the thick white soup full of potatoes, onions, and chunks of clam. The cream made it rich, and the clams made it taste like the ocean. Every family had their own recipe and thought theirs was the only right way. Canned clams cost 40 cents, potatoes cost 10 cents, onions cost 5 cents, salt pork cost 20 cents, and cream cost 20 cents. 95 cents fed 8 people. The salt pork gave it a smoky flavor that bacon couldn't match. Grandmothers would dice the salt pork small and cook it until it was crispy. The onions would cook in the pork fat until they were soft and sweet. Potatoes and clam juice would simmer until the potatoes were tender. The clams and cream went in last and cooked for just 5 minutes. The clams couldn't overcook or they'd turn tough and rubbery. 5 minutes was exactly right, long enough to heat through but not long enough to toughen. This soup caused arguments. Some families said tomatoes belonged in clam chowder. New Englanders said that was Manhattan style and completely wrong. The white cream version was the only real clam chowder. This wasn't just soup. It was regional pride in a bowl, and grandmothers defended their version like it was family honor. The day after Christmas, the turkey or chicken carcass went into a pot with water, vegetables, and rice. By evening, you had soup that tasted like the holiday itself. The golden broth held tender rice and bits of leftover meat. A leftover carcass cost nothing. Rice cost 10 cents. Carrots cost 5 cents, and celery cost 5 cents. 20 cents fed 8 people. The bones gave the broth a rich flavor that plain chicken broth from the store couldn't match. Grandmothers would simmer the carcass for hours with onions, carrots, and celery. They'd strain out the bones and vegetables, then add fresh vegetables and rice to the broth. The rice would cook until it was tender and had absorbed the chicken flavor. The straining was important. Nobody wanted to bite into a small bone hidden in their soup. Grandmothers would pour the broth through a fine strainer to catch every tiny bone fragment. Some would add a squeeze of lemon juice at the end to brighten the flavor. Others would stir in fresh parsley or dill. The soup tasted like Christmas memories, familiar and comforting. This wasn't just leftover soup. It was proof that the bones were just as valuable as the meat, and Christmas dinner provided food for days if you knew how to use everything. 15 soups down. You're seeing how grandmothers stretched ingredients across days. The ham bone became soup. The turkey carcass became broth. Nothing got thrown away. They understood that the cheapest parts often had the most flavor if you knew how to coax it out through long, patient cooking. Beef soup bones and whatever vegetables were left in the cellar made soup that was different every time. Carrots, potatoes, tomatoes, green beans, corn, everything went into the pot. The dark brown broth tasted rich and beefy. Soup bones cost 25 cents, canned tomatoes cost 15 cents, and mixed vegetables cost 20 cents. 60 cents fed 12 people. The bones had meat attached, and that meat would fall off during the long cooking. Grandmothers would brown the bones in the oven first to develop deep flavor. The bones would simmer for hours until the meat was tender. They'd pull out the bones, pick off the meat, and add it back to the pot. Fresh or canned vegetables would go in during the last hour. The timing of adding vegetables was important. Carrots and potatoes took longer to cook than green beans or corn. Add everything at once, and some vegetables would be mush, while others were still hard. Some grandmothers would add a can of tomato juice to make the broth red and tangy. Others kept it brown and beefy. Both versions were good in different ways. This wasn't just vegetable soup. It was proof that soup was a way to use up everything before it went bad, and nothing had to be wasted. Celery that was getting soft and limp became soup instead of getting thrown away. The pale green soup was smooth and creamy, with a delicate celery flavor that wasn't too strong. This was the soup that grandmothers made when celery was about to go bad. Celery cost 5 cents per bunch, butter cost 15 cents, flour cost 5 cents, and milk cost 15 cents. 40 cents fed 6 people. The celery flavor was subtle and elegant, not overpowering like raw celery. Grandmothers would chop the celery, stalks, leaves, and all, and cook it in butter until it was very soft. Flour would make a paste, then milk would be stirred in gradually. The soup would simmer until it was thick and smooth. Some would puree it completely. Others left small pieces of celery for texture. The cooking of the celery was essential. Raw celery was too strong and stringy. Cooked until very soft, it became mild and sweet. This soup made people cry, not from onions, but from memory. This was the soup grandmothers made from scraps, from things that should have been thrown away. It tasted like nothing getting wasted. It tasted like the Depression, when even celery leaves had value. It reminded you that she grew up hungry, and that hunger never completely left her, even when times got better. This wasn't just cream soup. It was proof that poverty shaped how she saw food forever, and nothing, not even limp celery, deserved to be wasted. Winter squash from the cellar became soup that tasted sweet and creamy without adding sugar or cream. The bright orange soup was smooth as silk. Grandmothers made this when they wanted something special but didn't have money for expensive ingredients. One butternut squash cost 15 cents, an onion cost 3 cents, butter cost 10 cents, and chicken broth cost 10 cents. 38 cents fed 8 people. The squash's natural sweetness meant you didn't need to add anything else. Grandmothers would roast the squash in the oven until it was soft and caramelized. The onion would cook in butter until it was sweet. Everything would get pureed together with broth until it was completely smooth. A pinch of nutmeg at the end added warmth. The roasting was the secret. Boiled squash made watery soup. Roasted squash made soup that tasted rich and concentrated. Some would swirl in a spoonful of cream before serving. Others would top it with toasted pumpkin seeds. But the soup was delicious plain, just squash, onion, butter, and broth. This wasn't just squash soup. It was proof that vegetables could taste like dessert without adding sugar, and nature provided sweetness if you knew where to look for it. Dried mushrooms and pearl barley made soup that tasted earthy and rich. The mushrooms gave it a deep, almost meaty flavor, even though it had no meat. The barley made it thick and filling. Dried mushrooms cost 30 cents. Barley cost 10 cents. An onion cost 3 cents, and carrots cost 5 cents. 48 cents fed 10 people. The dried mushrooms had more flavor than fresh ones and lasted forever in the pantry. Grandmothers would soak the dried mushrooms in hot water to rehydrate them. That soaking water became part of the broth. It was too flavorful to throw away. The onions and carrots would cook in butter. Then the mushrooms, barley, and broth would simmer together for an hour. The soaking water was the secret. It was dark and concentrated, full of mushroom flavor. Pour it into the soup and the whole pot would taste rich and complex. Some grandmothers would add a splash of sherry at the end. The wine made the mushroom flavor even deeper and more sophisticated. The day after Christmas, the turkey carcass became soup with homemade egg noodles. The golden broth tasted like the holiday, and the noodles were tender and soft. This soup meant Christmas was over, but the memories remained. A turkey carcass cost nothing, flour for noodles cost 10 cents, eggs cost 5 cents, and vegetables cost 10 cents. 25 cents fed 10 people. The homemade noodles tasted better than store-bought and showed you cared enough to make them from scratch. Grandmothers would simmer the carcass all morning, then strain the broth and pick any meat off the bones. The noodles would be rolled thin, cut into strips, and dropped into the boiling broth. They'd cook for just 10 minutes until they were tender. The noodles had to be thin and delicate. Thick noodles were heavy and filled you up too fast. Thin noodles were elegant and let you taste the broth. This soup marked the end of Christmas. The turkey was gone. The decorations would come down soon, but the soup kept the holiday feeling alive for one more day. This wasn't just turkey soup. It was proof that good things didn't have to end completely. They could transform into something new that carried the memory forward. 20 soups down, 10 left. Every soup so far proved that grandmothers were artists who worked with bones, vegetables, and time. They turned scraps into meals and memories into comfort. The final 10 soups show how they made magic from nothing and fed families through the hardest winters. Spring asparagus in December seemed impossible, but canned asparagus made it work. The pale green soup was smooth and elegant, tasting like springtime even when snow covered the ground outside. This was the soup grandmother made when she wanted to serve something fancy without spending much money. Canned asparagus cost 25 cents, butter cost 15 cents, flour cost 5 cents, and cream cost 20 cents. 65 cents fed 6 people. The asparagus flavor was delicate and refined, nothing like the strong taste of overcooked asparagus. Grandmother would drain the asparagus and save the liquid. It became part of the soup base and carried flavor that shouldn't be wasted. She'd chop the asparagus into small pieces, keeping the tender tips separate to add at the end for garnish. The tough stems would cook in butter until they were very soft. The butter and flour would make a paste, then the asparagus liquid and milk would be stirred in gradually. The mixture would simmer until it was thick and smooth. Some of the cooked asparagus would be pureed into the soup to make it creamy and green. The rest would stay in small pieces for texture. The key was not overcooking the asparagus tips. They'd go in during the last 5 minutes so they stayed bright green and slightly firm. Overcooked asparagus turned gray-green and mushy, and the soup would look dull instead of fresh. Grandmother would serve this in her best bowls with a swirl of cream on top and a few asparagus tips arranged in the center. The presentation made it look like restaurant food, even though it came from a can. She understood that how you served something was just as important as how you cooked it. The soup tasted like hope. In the middle of winter, when everything was brown and gray and cold, this green soup reminded you that spring would come again. The asparagus flavor was gentle and sweet, not harsh or bitter. The cream made it rich and luxurious. Each spoonful felt special. This was the soup grandmother made when someone was sick and needed comfort. The smooth texture was easy to swallow. The warm cream settled upset stomachs. The asparagus provided vitamins without being heavy. She'd carry a bowl upstairs to the bedroom, and the person who was sick would feel cared for before they even tasted it. Some days she'd add a handful of fresh peas during the last few minutes of cooking. The bright green peas against the pale green soup looked beautiful, and the sweet peas balanced the asparagus' slight bitterness. Other days she'd stir in a spoonful of lemon juice at the end to brighten all the flavors. This wasn't just canned asparagus in cream. It was proof that grandmother could make something elegant and beautiful from ordinary ingredients. It was proof that presentation mattered, that serving food with care made it taste better. It was proof that even in winter, even when money was tight, you could bring a little bit of spring to the table and remind everyone that hard times don't last forever. Black beans made soup that was so dark it was almost purple. The thick, rich soup had a deep, earthy flavor that was completely different from any other bean soup. This was the soup grandmother made when she wanted something substantial and filling that would stick to your ribs all day. Black beans cost 15 cents per pound, an onion cost 3 cents, garlic cost 2 cents, and a ham bone cost nothing if you saved it. 20 cents fed 12 people. The beans turned the cooking water black and made the whole pot look mysterious and exotic. Grandmother would soak the beans overnight, then drain them and start fresh with new water. The soaking water was too dark and bitter to use. She'd add the ham bone, onions, and garlic, then let everything simmer for hours until the beans were completely soft and starting to fall apart. The long cooking was essential. Black beans needed more time than other beans to become tender. Rush them, and they'd stay hard in the center no matter how long you cooked them. But cook them long enough, and they'd break down into a thick, creamy soup that was almost like pudding. Grandmother would fish out the ham bone and pick off any meat clinging to it. Some of the beans would be mashed against the side of the pot to make the soup even thicker. A splash of vinegar at the end brightened all the flavors and cut through the richness. The soup would be served with a dollop of sour cream on top and a sprinkle of chopped onions. The white sour cream against the black soup looked dramatic and beautiful. The tangy cream balanced the earthy beans perfectly. This soup tasted like the earth itself. The beans had a flavor that was hard to describe, not sweet, not bitter, just deeply savory and satisfying. The ham bone added smokiness, the garlic added sharpness, the vinegar added brightness. Every element worked together to create something complex and interesting. Grandmother made this soup on the coldest days of winter when you needed something that would warm you from the inside out. The thick soup coated your stomach and kept you full for hours. One bowl was a meal by itself. 2 bowls meant you wouldn't be hungry until the next day. Some days she'd add a pinch of cumin and a bay leaf to make it taste more exotic and interesting. Other days she'd keep it simple and let the beans speak for themselves. Both versions were good, just different. The soup got better the next day after the flavors had time to blend together. Grandmother would make a big pot and serve it for 3 days in a row. By the 3rd day, it was so thick you could almost cut it with a knife. Before it came in cans, cream of chicken soup was made from scratch with a whole chicken, butter, flour, and cream. The pale yellow soup was silky, smooth, and tasted like pure chicken essence. This was the soup grandmother made when someone was recovering from illness and needed gentle, nourishing food. A whole chicken cost 75 cents, butter cost 20 cents, flour cost 5 cents, and cream cost 20 cents. $1.20 fed 8 people, with leftover chicken for sandwiches the next day. The chicken flavor was clean and pure, nothing like the metallic taste of canned soup. Grandmother would simmer the whole chicken with onions, carrots, and celery until the meat was falling off the bones. This took 2 hours of gentle cooking. She'd strain the broth and save it, then pick all the meat off the bones. The vegetables would be discarded. They'd given all their flavor to the broth and had nothing left to offer. The soup base started with butter and flour cooked together until they were golden and nutty smelling. The chicken broth would be whisked in gradually so no lumps formed. The mixture would simmer until it was thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. Finally, cream would be stirred in, along with some of the shredded chicken. The technique was everything. The butter and flour had to cook long enough to lose their raw flour taste, but not so long that they burned. The broth had to be added slowly and whisked constantly. The cream had to be warm before it went in, or it would curdle and ruin the soup. Grandmother would serve this soup with homemade crackers or toast points. The soup was rich enough that you didn't need much else. A small bowl with some bread was a complete meal that satisfied without being heavy. This soup carried healing properties that went beyond nutrition. The warm cream soothed sore throats. The chicken provided protein for recovery. The smooth texture was easy to swallow when you didn't feel like eating. But more than that, the soup carried love. Making it from scratch took hours of work, simmering the chicken, straining the broth, making the base, shredding the meat. Every step showed that grandmother cared enough to spend her time making you feel better. The soup tasted like comfort itself, rich but not heavy, flavorful but not overwhelming, warm and soothing, and exactly what you needed when you were sick or sad or just needed to feel taken care of. Some days, grandmother would add fresh peas or diced carrots during the last few minutes of cooking. The vegetables would add color and texture without changing the fundamental nature of the soup. Other days, she'd stir in fresh parsley or dill at the end for brightness. The leftover chicken would become chicken salad for lunch the next day. The carcass would go back into a pot with water to make more broth. Nothing was wasted. The chicken provided multiple meals, and every part had value and purpose. This curry-spiced soup came from British India and somehow ended up on American Christmas tables. The golden soup had chunks of chicken, rice, apples, and a complex blend of spices that made it taste exotic and mysterious. This was the soup grandmother made when she wanted to serve something different and worldly. Chicken pieces cost 50 cents, rice cost 10 cents, an apple cost 5 cents, curry powder cost 15 cents, and coconut milk cost 20 cents. $1 fed 8 people. The curry powder made it smell like faraway places and taste like adventure. Grandmother would brown the chicken pieces in butter until they were golden, then set them aside. Onions, carrots, and celery would cook in the same pan, picking up all the browned bits from the chicken. The curry powder would go in next and toast for a minute to wake up the spices. Then chicken broth would be added and everything would simmer until the chicken was tender. The apples were the surprise ingredient. Diced tart apples would go in during the last 20 minutes of cooking. They'd soften, but not fall apart, adding little pockets of sweetness that balanced the savory curry. The rice would cook directly in the soup, absorbing the curry flavor and making the soup thick and hearty. The curry powder had to be good quality. Cheap curry powder tasted dusty and flat. Good curry powder was fragrant and complex, with layers of flavor that developed as the soup cooked. Grandmother would buy the best curry powder she could afford because it made such a difference in the final soup. The coconut milk would go in at the very end, just before serving. It would make the soup creamy and rich and add a subtle sweetness that tied all the flavors together. Too much coconut milk, and the soup would be too rich. Just the right amount made it luxurious without being heavy. This soup confused people the first time they tried it. The combination of chicken, apples, curry, and coconut seemed wrong, but after the first spoonful, they understood. The flavors worked together in a way that was surprising and delicious. The curry was warm and spicy. The apples were sweet and tart. The coconut was creamy and mild. The chicken was savory and satisfying. Grandmother would serve this soup with a dollop of plain yogurt on top and a sprinkle of fresh cilantro. The cool yogurt balanced the warm curry. The fresh cilantro added brightness and made it look fancy. This soup tasted like the world was bigger than your small town. It tasted like there were other ways to cook and other flavors to discover. It tasted like curiosity and adventure and the willingness to try something new. Some families thought it was too strange and stuck with their traditional soups, but other families fell in love with it and made it part of their Christmas tradition. The exotic soup became familiar through repetition, and eventually it didn't seem strange at all. It just seemed like Christmas. This Scottish soup combined lamb, barley, and root vegetables into something hearty and warming. The broth was rich and meaty. The barley was thick and chewy, and the vegetables were tender and sweet. This was the soup Grandmother made when she wanted to honor her Scottish heritage and remember where her family came from. Lamb neck bones cost 30 cents, barley cost 10 cents, and root vegetables cost 20 cents. 60 cents fed 10 people. The lamb gave the soup a distinctive flavor that was different from beef or chicken, slightly gamey, but in a good way that tasted wild and authentic. Grandmother would brown the lamb bones in a hot pan to develop deep flavor, then simmer them for hours with water, onions, and a bay leaf. The long cooking would make the meat fall off the bones and the broth turn rich and golden. She'd strain everything, pick the meat off the bones, and start building the soup. The barley would go in first because it took the longest to cook. Pearl barley needed about 45 minutes to become tender and plump. As it cooked, it would release starch that made the soup thick and almost creamy. The barley would absorb the lamb flavor and become savory and satisfying. The vegetables were traditional Scottish roots: turnips, carrots, and leeks. Grandmother would dice them small so they'd cook evenly and be easy to eat. The turnips added a slight bitterness that balanced the rich lamb. The carrots added sweetness. The leeks added a mild onion flavor that was more sophisticated than regular onions. The soup would simmer until everything was tender and the flavors had blended together completely. A handful of fresh parsley at the end would add brightness and color. Some days, Grandmother would add a splash of whiskey during the last few minutes of cooking. The alcohol would cook off, but leave behind a subtle warmth and complexity. This soup tasted like history. It tasted like cold Scottish winters and families gathered around the fire. It tasted like her grandmother's kitchen in the old country, even though Grandmother had never been there herself. The recipe had been passed down through generations, and making it connected her to ancestors she'd never met. The soup was substantial enough to be a complete meal. The lamb provided protein. The barley provided carbohydrates and fiber. The vegetables provided vitamins. One bowl would fill you up and keep you satisfied for hours. 2 bowls meant you wouldn't be hungry again until the next day. Grandmother would tell stories while the soup simmered. Stories about Scotland, about her grandmother, about the old ways of doing things. The soup carried those stories in every spoonful. Eating it meant participating in family history and keeping traditions alive. 25 soups down, 5 left. These final soups show how Grandmother used food to connect past and present, to honor heritage while creating new traditions. Every soup carried stories, memories, and love. The last 5 prove that the simplest ingredients could create the most profound connections. This Russian beet soup was bright magenta and tasted earthy and slightly sweet. The beets stained everything they touched: the pot, the spoon, your lips. This was the soup Grandmother made when she wanted to remember her Russian grandmother and the old country none of them would ever see again. Beets cost 10 cents per bunch, cabbage cost 8 cents, an onion cost 3 cents, and sour cream cost 20 cents. 41 cents fed 10 people. The beets turned the soup such a vivid color that it looked almost unnatural, like something magical rather than food. Grandmother would peel and dice the beets, being careful not to stain her hands too badly. The beets would simmer with cabbage, onions, and a little vinegar until everything was tender. Some of the vegetables would be pureed to make the soup thick and smooth. Others would stay in chunks for texture. The vinegar was essential. Without it, the soup would taste flat and muddy. The acid brightened the beet flavor and made it taste clean and fresh instead of earthy and dull. Just the right amount of vinegar transformed the soup from ordinary to extraordinary. The soup would be served hot or cold, depending on the season. In winter, hot borscht with a dollop of sour cream was warming and comforting. In summer, cold borscht was refreshing and light. Both versions were traditional, and both were good in different ways. The sour cream was crucial. It would swirl into the magenta soup and create beautiful pink patterns. The tangy cream balanced the sweet beets perfectly. Every spoonful had to have some sour cream, or it wasn't right. This soup carried memories of a place grandmother had never been, but somehow knew intimately through stories. Her grandmother had made this soup in Russia before coming to America. The recipe had traveled across the ocean in her grandmother's memory, passed down through spoken instructions and demonstrations in the kitchen. Making borscht meant connecting to that history. The bright color reminded grandmother of her grandmother's stories about Russian winters and celebrations. The earthy beet flavor tasted like the old country, like roots that went deep into soil she'd never touched. Some days she'd add a boiled potato to each bowl. Other days she'd stir in fresh dill at the end. Both additions were traditional, and both made the soup even better. The potato made it more filling. The dill added brightness and made it smell like summer. The soup stained everything: bowls, spoons, dish towels, even the sink. But grandmother didn't mind. The stains were proof that she'd made something real and substantial. The magenta color was proof that she'd honored her heritage and kept the old traditions alive. This Italian soup combined meatballs, greens, and tiny pasta in a clear chicken broth. The name meant the marriage of flavors, meat and vegetables coming together perfectly. This was the soup grandmother made for special occasions when she wanted to show off her Italian cooking skills. Ground meat cost 30 cents, escarole cost 10 cents, tiny pasta cost 10 cents, eggs cost 5 cents, and Parmesan cheese cost 20 cents. 75 cents fed 8 people. The meatballs were so small and tender they'd melt in your mouth. The greens were slightly bitter and balanced the rich meatballs perfectly. Grandmother would make the meatballs tiny, about the size of marbles. She'd mix ground beef with eggs, breadcrumbs, Parmesan cheese, and parsley, then roll them between her palms until they were perfectly round. The small size meant they'd cook quickly in the soup and be easy to eat with a spoon. The chicken broth had to be homemade and very clear. Cloudy broth would make the soup look muddy instead of elegant. She'd simmer chicken bones for hours, then strain the broth through cheesecloth to remove every particle. The resulting broth would be golden and transparent like amber. The escarole would be washed thoroughly to remove all the dirt, then chopped into bite-sized pieces. The slightly bitter greens would go into the boiling broth and wilt down immediately. The meatballs would be added next and would poach gently in the hot broth. Finally, the tiny pasta, acini di pepe or orzo, would cook until tender. The soup had to be served immediately, while everything was hot and the pasta was perfectly cooked. Wait too long, and the pasta would absorb too much broth and become mushy. Serve it right away, and every element was perfect. Tender meatballs, crisp, tender greens, firm pasta, and clear broth. Grandmother would grate fresh Parmesan cheese over each bowl at the table. The cheese would melt slightly in the hot broth and add a nutty, salty flavor that tied everything together. Some people would add more cheese, others would leave it plain. Both ways were right. This soup tasted like celebration. The meatballs were special. You didn't make tiny meatballs for everyday meals. The clear broth showed that someone had taken time to make it properly. The fresh Parmesan meant the family could afford good cheese. Every element signaled that this was a special occasion. The soup was light enough to serve as a first course before a big meal, but substantial enough to be a meal by itself. One bowl warmed you up and got your appetite going. 2 bowls filled you up completely. Grandmother made this soup for Christmas Eve. for Easter, for baptisms and confirmations, and any time the family gathered for something important. The soup marked occasions and made them feel significant. This wasn't just meatball soup. It was proof that Italian cooking valued both simplicity and elegance. It was proof that the best dishes didn't need complicated techniques or expensive ingredients, just good ingredients treated with care and respect. It was proof that grandmother understood that food was how you showed love and marked important moments. It was proof that a bowl of soup could make an ordinary day feel special and a special day feel sacred. This Louisiana soup was thick and spicy, full of shrimp, sausage, and okra. The dark roux gave it a deep, complex flavor that was unlike any other soup. This was the soup grandmother made when she wanted to bring a taste of the South to the Christmas table and show that holiday food didn't have to be traditional to be special. Shrimp cost 60 cents, andouille sausage cost 40 cents, okra cost 15 cents, flour cost 5 cents, and the holy trinity of onions, celery, and bell peppers cost 15 cents. $1.35 fed 10 people. The roux took 45 minutes of constant stirring, but made the whole soup taste rich and sophisticated. Grandmother would start with the roux, equal parts flour and oil cooked together over medium heat. She'd stir constantly as the mixture went from white to blonde to brown to dark chocolate. The roux couldn't burn, or the whole pot would taste bitter and have to be thrown out. This was the most nerve-wracking part of making gumbo, and it required complete attention. Once the roux was dark enough, the Holy Trinity would go in: diced onions, celery, and bell peppers. The vegetables would sizzle and release their moisture, stopping the roux from getting any darker. The mixture would cook until the vegetables were soft, then chicken broth would be added gradually. The okra would go in next. Some people didn't like okra because it was slimy, but that sliminess was what made gumbo thick and gave it the right texture. The okra would cook until it was tender and had released all its thickening properties into the soup. The sausage would be sliced and browned separately, then added to the pot. The shrimp would go in during the last 5 minutes so they wouldn't overcook and turn rubbery. File powder, ground sassafras leaves, would be stirred in at the very end to add a distinctive earthy flavor. The gumbo would be served over rice with hot sauce on the side. Everyone had different tolerance for spice, so they could add as much or as little hot sauce as they wanted. The rice would soak up the flavorful broth and make the soup more filling. This soup tasted like New Orleans, even if grandmother had never been there. The complex flavors, the nutty roux, the spicy sausage, the briny shrimp, the earthy file powder, all worked together to create something that was more than the sum of its parts. Making gumbo was an act of courage. The roux could burn, the okra could be slimy, the spices could be too much. But when everything came together right, the soup was transcendent and worth every minute of stirring and worrying. This Greek lemon chicken soup was silky, smooth, and tasted bright and tangy. The egg and lemon mixture made it creamy without adding any cream. This was the soup grandmother made when she wanted something light and elegant that tasted like sunshine in the middle of winter. Chicken broth cost 20 cents, rice cost 10 cents, eggs cost 5 cents, and lemons cost 10 cents. 45 cents fed 6 people. The lemon made it taste fresh and alive, completely different from heavy winter soups. Grandmother would start with homemade chicken broth, clear and golden and full of flavor. The rice would cook in the broth until it was tender and had absorbed some of the chicken flavor. This took about 20 minutes. The soup had to be very hot before the egg-lemon mixture went in. The egg-lemon mixture was the tricky part. Grandmother would beat eggs with fresh lemon juice until they were frothy and pale yellow. Then she'd slowly add hot broth to the eggs, whisking constantly. This step was called tempering, and it was essential. Add the eggs to the hot soup too quickly, and they'd scramble and turn into egg drop soup instead of staying smooth and creamy. Once the eggs were tempered, the mixture would be poured back into the pot of soup while whisking constantly. The soup would thicken immediately and turn pale and creamy. It couldn't boil after the eggs went in, or they'd curdle and ruin the texture. The soup would be served immediately while it was hot and silky. A sprinkle of fresh dill on top added color and a bright herbal flavor that complemented the lemon. Some people would add extra lemon juice to their bowl if they liked it more tart. This soup tasted like spring even in December. The lemon was bright and cheerful. The eggs made it rich and satisfying without being heavy. The rice added substance and made it filling enough to be a meal. Grandmother would make this soup when someone was feeling sad or sick, or just needed something gentle and comforting. The smooth texture was easy to swallow. The lemon was refreshing and woke up your appetite. The warmth settled in your stomach and made you feel cared for. The soup couldn't be reheated because the eggs would curdle. You had to make exactly enough for one meal and eat it all. This meant the soup was always fresh and never tasted like leftovers. This Charleston soup was the most luxurious thing Grandmother ever made. Female crabs with their orange roe, heavy cream, sherry, and butter created soup that tasted like the ocean and elegance combined. This was the soup she made once a year on Christmas Eve when she wanted to prove that poor people could eat like rich people if they saved and planned and cared enough to try. Female crabs cost $1, heavy cream cost 30 cents, butter cost 20 cents, and sherry cost 40 cents. $1.90 fed 6 people. This was expensive, more than any other soup. But Grandmother saved all year to make it because it made Christmas feel truly special. The soup started with crab meat picked from female crabs. The orange roe was essential. It gave the soup its distinctive color and rich flavor. Male crabs wouldn't work. The roe had to be there. Grandmother would pick through the crab meat carefully to remove any shell fragments. Even one piece of shell could ruin a spoonful of soup. She'd make a cream base with butter, flour, and fish stock. Then add the heavy cream and let it simmer until it was thick and velvety. The crab meat and roe would go in gently so they wouldn't break apart. The soup would heat through but never boil. Boiling would make the cream separate and the crab meat tough. The sherry went in at the very end, just before serving. Too much sherry and the soup would taste like alcohol. Just the right amount added a subtle sweetness and complexity that made the crab flavor even better. A pat of butter would float on top of each bowl, melting into the hot soup and making it even richer. This soup tasted like luxury. The cream was thick and coating. The crab was sweet and delicate. The roe added a briny richness that was almost indescribable. The sherry added warmth and depth. Every spoonful felt expensive and special. Grandmother would serve this soup in her best china bowls with her best silver spoons. The presentation was part of the experience. This wasn't everyday food served in everyday dishes. This was special food that deserved special treatment. Making this soup meant Grandmother had saved enough money to buy expensive ingredients. It meant she'd planned ahead and ordered the female crabs from the fish market. It meant she'd spent hours picking crab meat and making the soup from scratch. Every element required effort, money, and care. This soup proved that being poor didn't mean you couldn't have beautiful things sometimes. It proved that if you saved and planned and worked hard, you could create moments of luxury and elegance even when money was always tight. It proved that Grandmother valued beauty and special occasions and believed her family deserved to feel rich at least once a year. Which of these 30 soups did your grandmother make every Christmas? Comment the soup name in your state. I'm mapping where these traditions stayed alive the longest. These soups represented more than meals. They represented patience, the hours of simmering, the overnight soaking, the constant stirring. They represented thrift, using bones, saving ham hocks, wasting nothing. They represented heritage, recipes carried from other countries, other generations, other kitchens. They represented hope that hard times would pass, that families would gather, that Christmas would come again. Her legacy lives on in the few families who still make these soups from scratch, in the grandchildren who learned to make roux without burning it, in the great-grandchildren who know that good soup takes all day and can't be rushed. She proved that the best things require time, that simple ingredients become extraordinary through patience and care, that Christmas magic comes from effort, not money, that a pot of soup could warm more than just your body. It could warm your heart and remind you that you were loved. Subscribe for more forgotten recipes from America's past. Next video covers 30 Depression-era casseroles nobody makes anymore. From her kitchen to yours, don't let them forget what our grandmothers knew how to make, and don't let them forget why she spent all day making it.